Good evening, everyone, and a very warm welcome to the launch of CSEP's Sambandh Database and Map. We are delighted to unveil the first phase of this project, one that has been in the making for quite some time. In our foreign policy and security studies vertical at CSEP. This Sambandh database and map is an effort to visualize and track India's physical connectivity initiatives with the neighboring countries. Too often we hear that India is not connected enough with the neighboring countries, or there have been project delays, or India has not been doing enough. So this effort, this database and map is an effort to put some of that information out on what is really happening in terms of connectivity and regional integration efforts at the ground level by bringing together data, timeline, and some geospatial information. We are very happy to launch this database today and to follow up this launch with a panel discussion on India-Bhutan connectivity for the next decade, which is also the focus of the first phase of this database. We focus on India Bhutan specifically for this first phase because over the past year, we have seen renewed momentum in India Bhutan connectivity, marked not just by high level visits between Thimphu and New Delhi, but also a growing engagement at the subnational level. With new and emerging connectivity projects underway, from railways to multimodal connectivity linkages, it is now a good time to ask, where is this partnership headed over the next 10 years? What are the lessons from past experiences that we should carry forward? And most importantly, how will India-Bhutan connectivity evolve in the light of shifting in the light of shifting geopolitical landscape in this region? To help us reflect on these questions, we are honored to have with us today Professor Mahendra Lama, who really needs no introduction in this space and whose scholarship we have all benefited from. Professor Lama is a senior professor at the School of International Studies at Jawaharlal Nehru University and the founding vice chancellor of the Central University of Sikkim. His contributions to both academic research and policy formulation on regional connectivity are widely recognized. We're equally pleased to be joined by Dr. Constantino Xavier, Senior Fellow at CSEP, where he leads the Sambandh Initiative on Regional Connectivity. He's also a non-resident fellow at the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C., and has very importantly played a key role in shaping the vision behind this Sambandh database and map. Thank you both for being with us. Thank you both for joining us today and for agreeing to offer your reflections on this. Before we begin the discussion, I'd like a few minutes to just put forward a presentation on what the Sambandh database and map is about, which is now live and accessible to everyone, free of cost, as we've been asked some time back. So let me start by making a short presentation on the Sambandh database and map, following which we will go into the panel discussion with Professor Lama and Dr. Xavier. Before we begin this presentation, I would also like to thank several people who have been instrumental in the building of this database. Firstly, CSEP President Dr. Lavish Bhandari and our distinguished fellow Ambassador Shiv Shankar Menon for their vision and guidance. And I'd also like to acknowledge the role played by several of our former research analysts and interns, Anahat Kaur, Nadine Montero, Ritika Kaila, Kia Kalra Gupta, and Dhruv Banerjee and Aishwarya Jha in really building this database and building and just putting it so much effort into a couple of months in building this database. Sorry, just a second. Yes. So in terms of what we're going to cover today is what is this database and map? Why did we build it? What is the importance and relevance of it? Who are the key stakeholders we intend to use? How do we intend to use this platform? So Sambandh is so this database and map, this is aimed to be a dynamic form that consolidates and visualizes India's infrastructure links with its neighboring countries. We're looking at the immediate neighborhood right now, South Asia and the Bay of Bengal region, to map all of India's physical infrastructure projects with the neighboring countries. The objective was to create this first regional connectivity data. As I mentioned before, too often we hear that this region is not connected enough, maybe India is not doing enough, the linkages are not working. What is the status? Are they operational? Are they not operational? That is a sort of knowledge gap that we wanted to bridge by building this database, by visualizing what is the kind of connectivity that exists today. We narrowed down to 4 keys of energy infrastructure, water infrastructure, land infrastructure, railways, roadways, and maritime infrastructure in terms of inland waterways. In this first phase, we mainly focus on the physical linkages, and we sort of map all the data of about a particular project from its inception stage to completion. Now, the primary emphasis, as you can see from the sectors, is on transportation and energy infrastructure connections. And we want our users to really have a feel of what are the diverse connectivity links in this region. Our aim is to cover all, the physical infrastructure linkages with all of the neighboring countries that India have in its immediate neighborhood. This is what the Sambandh database looks like when you log into it. There is a filter panel on the left, which will allow you to choose and select a specific kind of infrastructure you want to see. In terms of the current status of the infrastructure, whether it's operational, planned, under construction, suspended. You could also filter by project name, project location, and entities, whether it was built by a public sector enterprise or a private sector company. You can filter it by different institutions, different entities as well. Currently, this database is live with all of India's physical linkage projects with Bhutan. We have 39 mapped, visualized on the map, but there are 40 projects in total. Once you hover over one of these red pins where a project is located, a small information box pops up, which gives you the basic details about these projects. And if you want to view more details in terms of what is happening with these projects, we also have project-specific pages which map the entities, the status, the timeline of the project from the inception to the current stage as of September 2024. This has been done for all of the 40 projects between India and Bhutan. Now, we wanted to build this database for several reasons. One, of course, that India's neighborhood is a policy priority. It is, Foreign Minister Jaishankar in 2019 called the neighborhood the first circle of priority. We wanted to bridge the knowledge gap about the increasing number and types of connectivity linkages we have today. Linkages are intuitive. We know their land languages, we know their land ports, but there are integrated checkposts, new railway lines being constructed, air corridors, inland waterways, petroleum pipelines, coastal shipping, data connectivity. We are talking about a huge range of connectivity initiatives between India and its neighboring countries, which are important to map to really understand the gravity of connectivity linkages between India and its neighbors. We also want to put, by using this database, we also want to put forward a non-Western approach to connectivity and really show how India is approaching this through different entities, through project completion timelines, etc., and what this means for regional integration. We also hope that this database will support in sequencing, prioritizing, coordination, and alignment for policymakers and researchers when we are talking about connectivity projects in the region. And of course, cooperation and coordination with like-minded actors like Japan, Australia, and others, the European Union, who want to be invested in this neighborhood. Now, the importance of this database lies in the fact that this is mainly an information repository that is meant to strengthen policy debates about India's regional connectivity. We hope that it will support the policy making process, the policymakers in their process, in their thinking about India's connectivity projects, and also inform India's connectivity strategy through new research, knowledge, data, which is sometimes missed or overlooked. And of course, we are also open to collaborating with different institutions on this database. I'm sure, as much effort as we have made in building this database, I'm sure there's something missed or something new that can be added that will only refine this further. So we are also aiming for those kind of collaborations. The key stakeholders are, across the board through policymakers, the Ministry of External Affairs, NSCS, Land Ports Authority of India, Exim Bank in India, but also also policymakers in the neighboring countries for whom this database is going to be useful. A lot of public and private sector investment that is going into the neighboring countries. This database can also be useful in terms of in terms of accessing details about a particular project, and of course, the research community and international stakeholders who are interested in India and its neighborhood. With this, how do we plan to use this database? This is mainly aimed to be a visualization and reporting tool where we synthesize all the data points into a common repository. We hope to develop analytical insights, map and compare across different projects and decades and project timelines, and trends and connectivity projects in terms of newer projects emerging. Now, the database does have some limitations. What we have not been able to map in the database is the cost of construction of each project. That was there were different information on different platforms. So that is something we've not been able to synthesize. But as we refine and develop this database further, we hope to add that data as well. And the map will be used to facilitate further research outputs, especially in terms of tracking the momentum and completion of infrastructure projects. If we talk about the last 10 to 12 years, we have seen a huge number of infrastructure projects, either in the neighborhood, either being initiated or a number of legacy projects being completed. So this database is going to be useful in mapping all of those for further research. We aim to update this database on a half-yearly basis. So as regular information as we can provide to this database. Now, first phase of this database focuses on 40 links between India and Bhutan. We further aim in phase 2 to add projects between India, Nepal, and India and China, with Bangladesh and Myanmar in phase 3, with Sri Lanka and the Maldives in phase 4, and finally Pakistan and Afghanistan in phase 5. This is how we are looking at broadly going forward this database, but we are very happy to have any comments or feedback on this database as you may have, and looking forward also to listening to Professor Lama and Dr. Xavier on their thoughts and reflections on this database today. Professor Lama, if I can invite you first to share your reflections and thoughts on the database. Professor Lama, you're on mute.
Thank you very much, Riya, for such a comprehensive and such an innovative presentation on both the mapping and mobilizing a very interesting database on India's connectivity projects with Bhutan. So first of all, let me congratulate both you and Dr. Xavier for such a valuable contributions to the researchers, policymakers, who have been looking into these projects. I found it to be very interesting in terms of three basic aspects. First, of course, is it is very innovative. Second, it is scientifically presented. And thirdly, it is pretty comprehensive. So I'm sure there will be a large number of users from both within South Asia and outside South Asia. And the more critical thing is now it is available at one place, one platform. So anybody can access, anybody can make use of it. I have, when I was going through this particular collection of database and mapping, I could see that there is somewhat everybody would, somewhat a kind of a glaring absence of the fact that people would really like to look into what is the historical background, right? And in that context, I think your team would be contributing another pretty substantive aspect of it by bringing a little bit of historical aspects of it. For example, why connectivity projects between India and Bhutan? Uh, we started with what you call it, the development assistance and development participation, because Bhutan was deeply, what you call it, impoverished, and of course, very highly underdeveloped. And in that context, we started it. And if you, that is clearly indicated, if you just see the 5-year plans and India's contributions. I was just looking through the first 5-year plan India initiated in Bhutan, along with Bhutan, was in 61, 66, and the total outlay was 10 crore. And India contributed 100% of that 10 crore. Then gradually, today, it has gone up to almost 2,000, 3,000 plus crore, and India would contribute uh, a substantive amount. So I think contextualization is very, very important, because that particular development base would trigger so many connectivity projects, right? I think that is the only thing I would like to suggest, so that it is very useful to the users. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Lama. Tino, if I may come to you next, you have seen this database develop from day one, from the day we created the first file for this database. How do you see, what is your vision of taking this database forward?
Well, I think your presentation does it very well in terms of mapping out what the vision should be and is, which is taking this to other neighboring countries. So we've done Bhutan, which is the smallest neighbor of India. And still, it took us a long time to map 40 projects. And as Professor Lama mentioned, that's valuable, but it's just the beginning of the journey. So that's one. I think two is we have to remind ourselves that we're sitting in a region that has 1/4 of humanity. 2 billion people are living in South Asia. If you add parts of China, Central Asia, Iran, Yunnan in China, Myanmar, Thailand, which are all sort of broader neighborhood of India, you come to pretty much 1 in 3 humans who are living 4 or 5 hours flight from Delhi. So this region is huge. It has a huge potential. And we can only improve, I think, what we call for this topic, for this event today, the infrastructure for integration, if we have a sense of what is progressing, what not, right? There's such a rush to do things now, such an effort to reconnect the bridges, the railways, the roads that used to exist, the waterways, the rivers, the ecosystems, the political economies that were integrated. That rush is welcome, but we can't just rush ahead blindly. I think hopefully our map will help decision makers, policy makers, scholars understand where things have moved, where they haven't. In fact, some of our projects, some of our files suggest that there's been also a lot of delays. There's been sometimes interruptions in some of these projects. Others have actually been completed ahead of time, which is complete news for India in the neighborhood, had never happened, maybe in the 50s, 60s sometimes, but certainly not in the last 20, 30 years.
Thank you, Tino. Professor Lama, if I may ask you, a question, because you mentioned the historical context of India-Bhutan connectivity. How would you assess? Because you mentioned India has been involved since the first 5-year plan, and the historical context was different. How would you assess the current state of connectivity based on the number of projects that we are doing bilaterally today?
Well, I think very interesting to note that that particular geography, what we call BBIN, or what we called in the late 90s as South Asia Growth Quadrangle, is very steadily heading towards to be one of the most uh, robust and resilient growth centers of South Asia. That is basically Eastern South Asia, India, Nepal, Bhutan, and Bangladesh, right? And there are four major developments at this particular point of time. That is where I would like to place the importance and criticality of your institution's effort, led by, of course, Dr. Xavier and the team. I think the four critical context is India's Actist policy and neighborhood first policy, where India has very clearly deviated from the past and started developing four-way connectivity. And the four-way connectivity is about connectivity within a particular state like Assam. The second is between two states in Northeast, say Nagaland and Tripura. And third is connectivity of these states or the Northeast region with the rest of India. And fourth is the connectivity of these Northeast states with the neighboring countries. And I think this has been done very consciously, particularly in the last decade or so, and we have seen the results. The second context is, of course, Bhutan coming into play a much more critical role in integrating with the rest of South Asia through northeast part of India, going down to Bangladesh, right, using even the deep sea ports like Matarbari. The third very important aspect, of course, is Bhutan, Nepal, Bangladesh, and India interconnected through the famous Fulbari corridor. I think that is going to be the most critical. That is about just 10 kilometers away from Darjeeling district's Siliguri subdivision. And that would actually bring together these four partners and do business on many non-traditional issues, including on tourism, education, health, pilgrimage, right? And the fourth, of course, is in the context of Bhutan, Bhutan's own preparations looking, towards looking to the south for development interventions and development connectivity. We have noticed over the last 10, 15 years, we have seen that Bhutan has started treating the northern part of Bhutan as a protection zone, and the real functional and the activity, economic activity, social, cultural activity zone would be towards the south. And that is adequately indicated by points like Phuntsholing and Jaigaon, or Samdok Jonkar and Daranga, or even Galefu, Kokrajhar. I think these are the four critical aspects that has brought together first connectivity to the forefront. Secondly, Bhutan's criticality as far as growth quadrangle is concerned. And third, India's core interest in its foreign policy matrices.
Thank you, Professor Lama. Tino, if I can ask you to elaborate on Professor Lama's last point, and this is something that we've heard you speak about a lot. That what are the drivers behind this? All of these improving connectivity linkages that Professor Lama also spoke about, like broadly, from your vantage point, how do these go beyond just economic value to really strengthen strategic linkages? Why is India investing so much today?
It's a vast menu of drivers, Riya. I think there's so many factors that explain this. I think everyone can pick and choose, and we see different people highlighting different drivers or factors. I mean, the most common one is that this is just part of a larger policy, but policies are not drivers, right? Policies are responses to what decision makers see as being important. And I'd say that the things that a typical Indian policymaker today sees as important depends at the various levels they're located. Let me start maybe at the most surprising one that we wouldn't think of when we talk about infrastructure connectivity, regional integration, building linkages, which is the Indian Army and the Indian security establishment. I think today you see over the last few years several declarations, objectives by different army leaders, for example, former Army Chief Manoj Naravane, who said that, to secure the Northeast, to have peace and stability, to end the decades of insurgency we've had that, and to ensure, therefore, security objectives, we need more connectivity with neighboring countries, Bhutan, Bangladesh, etc. So I think it's interesting that we have now have army chiefs, if you want, a traditionally conservative establishment, which used to say to secure the Northeast, we need to disrupt the linkages. We need to erect fences, barriers, monitor, which they still say, obviously, which is the role and duty of any security force. But today also this new narrative, which I think is telling that to ensure the political peace in the Northeast and the security of the Northeast, there is a need for economic linkages with neighboring countries. And in this case, the army has a role in playing and facilitating that. A second reason is maybe northwards. Professor Lama mentioned it, but sometimes I wonder whether India is doing with Bhutan what it could have, should have done with other neighboring countries 10, 20, 30 years ago or more, which means it's trying to build the interdependence that will give it economic growth, but also to bring growth and development to its neighboring countries, and therefore develop a symbiotic relationship that is mutually beneficial. And what I mean is that there will be a time T, any point in history. Some people will say 1 year from now, others will say 10 years from now. It doesn't matter. There will be a moment when China will develop direct connectivity linkages with Bhutan from the north. In fact, if you look at the border law that China signed into law or adopted into law a few years ago, it tells you how the PRC is thinking beyond just economics or security or disputed border, but has an integrated framework to connect, yes, principally economically with Nepal, Bhutan, and what they call the Himalayan Rim region, all the way from Central Asia to Yunnan and Myanmar, along that larger Himalayan belt. So as China builds its connectivity northwards with Bhutan, and we see the Chinese are trying to do that even with Bhutan, develop infrastructure on their side in the Tibetan Autonomous Region, pushing the Bhutanese slowly, nudging them if you want, or pushing maybe to develop that linkage. But I think everyone will agree that time will come and we will have some type of linkages that will be deeper between Bhutan and China. So therefore, India is, I think, preparing also for that. So one important driver is a geopolitical one, or an economic one, pick and choose, which is you want to integrate Bhutan before China does, for the mutual benefit of Bhutan and India. A third one we tend to neglect. I think Professor Lama mentioned it, and I'm so glad he brought these very state level analysis of why we talk about connectivity, which is we tend to think of connectivity as a national policy designed and implemented and taught here in New Delhi. Obviously, that happens. But I think in our work often, Riya, we find that it is states that are pushing for more connectivity. And I think the example of Bhutan over the last few years is quite interesting. If you see the levels of intensifying para-diplomacy by the state of Assam with Bhutan, and how Bhutan itself has also engaged Guwahati and Assam at various levels, whether visits by the king, the prime minister, different ministers. If I'm not wrong, a few years ago, they opened up their own consulate in Guwahati, the Bhutanese. So there's a variety of outreach that is happening today from the states. It is states that are saying we see growth markets or challenges of water sharing or mobility next door, and we actually would like, the center to help us to do that. It's not the other way around. And in some states, obviously, it is a center that is pushing, and states are not so interested. So these are maybe three factors that we don't think of. But just bottom line, Ria, and I work on IR and geopolitics, and we look at the world in that particular frame. But the main driver and the engine is one of economic growth. People want to grow, want to have development, and they realize that to ensure economic development, you need to connect with whatever is around you from the purest sense of geography. So if you're sitting in Patna, that means also thinking about Nepal. If you're sitting in Tripura and Agartala, that means connecting with Eastern Bangladesh. If you're sitting in Kohima, that means connecting with Myanmar. So, and if you're sitting in Guwahati, obviously, or in parts of Assam and West Bengal, that means also maybe looking northwards towards Bhutan.
Thank you, Tina. That also reminds me something that Professor Lama, you said earlier in our call today that the states are really the theaters of action. And that phrase, I can't remember where the connectivity initiatives take place. Professor Lama, to bring it back to you in the sense that you recently, wrote an SCAP report on connectivity in East and South Asia, and you propose the idea of economic corridors in East and South Asia. Now, this idea is something that we've also heard from the Asian Highway Initiative or the BIMSTEC Transport Master Plan. So could you unpack this idea of economic corridor in the East and South Asia? What does it look like? What are the various features of it, and how does it help with connectivity, not just India, Bhutan, but also looking southward for Bhutan, as you mentioned before?
Yeah, you see, the context today in East and South Asia is about a new variety of regionalism or sub-regionalism, which we call a new regionalism process. And everyone is keen to undertake this process precisely because of few critical factors. One is the internal dynamics. Bhutan's, say for example, the Western Bhutan is so developed, and Eastern and the Southern Bhutan remains fairly underdeveloped. There are very striking differences between what West is doing and what East and South Bhutan is doing. The second is you have multiple institutions developed, which used to be, for them, it used to be a no-go situations 10 years, 15 years back. Today, you find you name anyone, ADB to AIIB to World Bank to UN, they are all freely moving there, JICA, JETRO and all, right? So it's a new development partnership which has come up. The other very critical issue which has brought forth this idea of cross-border, cross-partnership-based economic corridor is the people in the Northeast would like to have a process of integration, which we call reverse integration. In the last 60 years, anyone in India, mainstream India, would think that it is Northeast which has to be integrated with the rest of India. Today, the government of India partly has realized that this is not going to work. So it is India, rest of India, that is going to actually integrate with the Northeast India. And these are several indicators towards this. Then the other very important aspect of this, the development model, Bhutan, Nepal, to a large extent, even Northeast, followed in the last 6 decades, 7 decades, have not been able to deliver the goods and services or the results they were actually thinking that they will deliver. So they are looking forward to a new development model where states, local partnership would be of critical importance. So this brings forth the idea of why economic corridor. Say, for example, 30% of Bangladeshis or the visa seekers would come to India for health purposes. So what we are saying is, in this economic corridor, there will be a borderland hospital which could be used by Bangladeshis, Myanmaris, Nepalese, Bhutanese. They will use and go back. They don't require a visa for that. They don't require any kind of support from anywhere. They will just, instead of going all the way to Mumbai or to Coimbatore or even to Madras, they will come to the border and we'll provide the best facilities. Then we are also floating the idea of, in this particular aspect only, a concept of mountain ports. After all, if you see the history of these geographies 200 years back, 150 years back, this used to be the thriving trade centers. This will be the thriving pilgrimage centers, tourism centers. This will be the thriving explorers, centers for the explorers, right? And over the years, we forgot because we converted the entire borderlands into what you call a geometric line, that is borders. And the moment we shifted our focus to borders as a geometric line, then the national security, orthodox national security started coming into being. Of course, there are reasons for doing that. but no more so. Say, for example, Fulbari corridor between India and Nepal, hardly 30 plus kilometers, linking Nepal's Kakari Vitta to Bangladesh's Banglaband. India did not allow for almost 60 years. In 1997, it was allowed, and today it is going to be one of the most critical corridors. So these economic corridors are not only meant for economic exchanges, they are meant for providing transit to countries, the member countries. Say, for example, Bhutan would provide transit to Arunachal Pradesh through Bhutan to come to Guwahati, which is a long, long journey. Bangladesh would provide transit for the Indian goods and services to move through Fulbari and to Bangladesh, then to the northeast part of it. That was the arrangement also. So these economic corridors are not a typical economic corridors that were promoted in the past. This is going to be a new varieties and new models also. Thank you.
It's a welcome idea to really not just think about trade corridors, but also how it evolves into improving people-to-people connectivity, those softer measures when we look at economic corridors, beyond just movement of goods in this region. But an important point you mentioned about development model, and Tino, if you can come in there, because in terms of looking at new development models, Bhutan has this ambitious plan to develop the Gelefu Mindfulness City as into a regional economic and spiritual hub. What what role can India play when it comes to linking with Gelefu Mindfulness City? How does it benefit India-Bhutan linkages, India-Bhutan connectivity? And what could be the role of the government and, more importantly, the private stakeholders in this particular vision, in these new models of development?
Yeah, glad you asked that, Riya. Because I think I was thinking, what are the lessons we can learn from, all the amazing things that have been achieved between India and Bhutan over the last 2, 3 years and are still in progress. We were looking at the list that Sushovan Chakrabarti, who works with us, had prepared. It was just a basic timeline of what has happened between India and Bhutan is formidable, right? The range, the extent of engagements, of visits, of projects, of dreams that we had dreamt about 20 years ago or longer that finally are coming to fruition slowly but steadily. I think there are a few lessons. Lesson number one, in terms of Galefu City that you mentioned, for example, is that infrastructure is key and must be key and critical. This region suffers from a huge infrastructure deficit. And of course, there are also dangerous ways in which you build infrastructure that can be unsustainable and not responsible to local demands. But then I think the only necessary condition is to invest in the basic physical and digital, also immaterial, but particularly physical infrastructure. It is amazing what happens when you build bridges, roads, when you allow people to navigate on rivers, when you give them good markets to trade in that have, a basic, infrastructure for people to feel safe, comfortable. So this region needs to keep investing on all sides in India, across India, in infrastructure that is still in some ways behind what it was in the 1960s and 1950s. And we've measured that the levels of infrastructure mobility that used to exist in this region, they have come down. We're still trying to correct that. Okay, so that's number one. And I'm a big believer in that sense of infrastructure because you can just see it. It's been, you go to these places on the borderlands. Riya, you've been to more than I have. And you see just a fascination of people moving where there are roads and trading when there are ways to facilitate trade. Recently we were on the India-Nepal border in Western Nepal, in the Tanakpur, Banbasa region of Uttarakhand, India, formerly Uttar Pradesh, in that corner of India and Nepal, which is just 6 hours away drive from Delhi. The last bridge over that Sardar River was built in the 1920s. And finally, we have now, I think 2 years ago, the new bridge, a 4-lane or 6-lane highway that is finally being built that is going to lead to a new integrated checkpost. And you cross that old bridge, which we still did, Riya, right? And you saw that it's completely congested. It is literally from the previous century. It's 100 years old. No investor will go into Nepal unless there is that bridge in place. No local trader will be able to expand their business unless there is that ease of mobility across the border. Two, I think the Galefu City also shows us that these things cannot just be bilateral between two countries. You need to rope in the rest of the world for financing, for support, for technical advice. So there's a variety of other actors. I think Professor Lama just mentioned a few of them, whether they're multilateral banks, key partners, financing agencies from Japan, the European Union Investment Bank, for example, which is very interested now in this region. So I think the Galefu City shows that the Bhutanese decision makers have consciously done an India first policy, coordinated with India on this and consulted with India, but at the same time reached out to the entire world to say, welcome world to Bhutan. Come to this region, and that is in line with our interests, India's interest, the Northeast interest, Assam interest, etc. A third lesson of that, I think, city project is that I think it's very important, we forget that sometimes, to explain to your own people why connectivity is good, why interdependence is good. There are a lot of losers of connectivity. We tend to be the popes of connectivity, Riya, and say it's great, let's integrate it. But for people on the ground sometimes, for example, truckers, if you are driving trucks to transport petroleum products across the India-Nepal border, and suddenly a pipeline is being announced and built, you will not be happy. You will be a loser of what we see an upgrade of connectivity, because now there's a pipeline that is safer, faster to share and exchange petroleum product between India and Nepal. So explaining and sometimes even overriding domestic concerns and deeply entrenched interests is important. And I think in Bhutan, the leadership has done this with the Bhutanese citizens and people. It has explained that more connectivity with India comes with challenges, demographic, ecosystem, economic challenges. 8 lakh people next to 1.4 billion people in India, 800,000, right? So obviously you have to explain to your people and regulate it and carefully explain why connectivity matters, maybe sometimes go slower, etc. So I think it's a very important lesson, because I think this is part of a larger Bhutanese program to connect with India, but it has also included a very important political and pedagogic element of different Bhutanese prime ministers, of course, the king, a variety of decision makers who have explained to the people why this is in Bhutan's interest. And finally, I'll just end with that. And again, I'm happy Professor Lama brought it up. And it's a very difficult issue. But it's a lesson from the India-Bhutan success story, is that we can talk all about bridges and roads and railways and infrastructure in terms of digital connectivity, but unless there's human mobility, it will be very difficult to achieve the levels of development and economic integration that we all desire in this region. And that's a tough one, because again, it affects political interest, ethnic balance, religious balances. It affects economic interests in terms of demographic and labor availability in the border regions. But my sense is, I think the ultimate objective must be a regime that we talked about in the 2000s has fallen backwards. It used to be talked on the SARC, which is one of free mobility across this region. It can be a regulated mobility, but it is still paradoxical that it's easier for people from around the world to come and visit the South Asian region than for people in the South Asian region to cross borders within the region. That is the great paradox, I think, of these times. It's a very difficult one to solve. But India, Bhutan, India, Nepal, to some extent, offer some interesting solutions. Maybe they can be replicated across the region.
Let me continue on that front of what you mentioned, because this is something we were discussing earlier as well, in terms of how, it needs to be communicated to the people that that land connectivity is equally important. And this is something we've written about before, that there is perhaps more emphasis on the maritime side of connectivity, on maritime development, on seaports, rather than, an equal emphasis being laid on land ports, because we have many of these digital systems I just spoke about already working, established at seaports, and comparatively at land ports. Sometimes when we go to the field and people are still asking, we need internet connectivity. So why has there been this mismatch between development of seaports, of maritime linkages, versus development of land linkages? Because that our land borders are equally important.
Yeah, first of all, it's important to just notice exactly what you just mentioned, Riya, which is the success of India's sort of maritime infrastructure, ports, connectivity policy over the last 10 years. including, plugging into international systems and agreements and the WTO facilitation, for example. I think I saw your statistics on how much progress India did and how Nepal, for example, I think is still stuck at 20%, right, in terms of
25.
And 25% in terms of the WTO facilitation commitments. But also the last 10 years, it's funny that we used to have in India there was a laggard. And for example, in Sri Lanka, where we were recently, Riya, right, we saw that the Sri Lankan ports and the maritime shipping industry and infrastructure industry was ahead of India. And I was reading Rohan Samarajiva's paper draft recently, where he's actually saying, listen, Sri Lanka's fallen back now and has actually a lot to learn from India on the ports and seaside. And that second, the reason why, Riya, to your point, this has happened also in India, is that, listen, 70% of India's trade, right, goes through maritime sea lines of communication. I think it's natural if you're open to the world, and India's economy is still in the process of opening to the world, that you want to connect with the great economies of the world, which tend to be beyond this region, right? So therefore, the maritime angle is very important. But now that also the region and the hinterlands are growing, right? That the Gangetic plains are finding development and growth that they had not seen in decades, maybe centuries. I think the shift of emphasis is going inland, right? So therefore, the government, the policies, the attention, the work that we're doing, I think is starting to look more into the inland region and how to plug in the inland roads and railways and rivers, for example, with the ports and the oceans to trade and facilitate. Also, as we speak increasingly about supply chains today, right? A Japanese company may want to invest in India as part of a larger supply chain, may want to invest in West Bengal and Tamil Nadu and the Northeast region to connect with further markets, maybe westwards in the Gulf region or in Europe. So therefore, for that, you need multimodal linkages, not just an entry point for India to import or export from its coastal regions, but also to develop something, maybe in internal industrial parks in the hinterland, then reship it to the other coast, Mumbai, let's say, if you think it from east to west, and then onwards, right? And therefore, we talk about IMEC today and about a variety of multimodal corridors. I think, therefore, you see that emphasis happening. And it's still maybe too early. I think we're still beginning to see this. And often we get this question, listen, it doesn't matter. It is tiny Bhutan, it is Nepal, it is Bangladesh, it is the hinterland of India. But my suspicion is as, yes, India grows and develops, more and more resources will be dedicated to develop this grid. In fact, that's the argument of our paper last year, Riya, where we wrote about the need to rebalance inwards now in terms of infrastructure development that connects with the region and the world.
Before I move on to posing the same question to Professor Lama, can I also request our audience, in case they have any questions for our panelists, to put them in the Q&A box for me, and which I can read out to our panelists later. Professor Lama, posing the same question to you and taking the example from your recent SCAP report, you specifically mentioned about the e-Suvidha system, which is prevalent between India, Bangladesh, in West Bengal, which is a parking mechanism for land ports, and something that Bhutan, while trading with Bangladesh, can also use this digital system. But it might also contravene provisions of the 2016 India-Bhutan trade agreement. So, in terms of land versus maritime versus challenges being, in implementing systems and processes and digital initiatives on the land borders itself, what are we missing? What are the challenges that keep cropping up? And, how do we address these concerns?
See, there are two very contrasting scenarios. One very crucial scenario is that India, Bhutan and Nepal would join India's Act East policy and use India's facilities that is created in the Northeast and ultimately leading to connecting with India's trilateral highway, India, Myanmar, Thailand trilateral highway, and using this route for trade, services, electricity, cells, health and traditional medicine systems, designs, textile designs, all kinds of things, right? You have a much, much larger scenario and vision like that. On the other hand, whatever connectivity we have created between Bhutan and India, say Phuncholing and Jaigaon, or Samduk Jongkar and Rangia in Assam, right? Daranga. You will find there are so many micro level, what you call constraints, and that vary from testing and quarantine facilities to paying the what you call the toll tax, right? And uh, software the incompatibility in the software that we use by these two countries, to the behavior of the customs officials, the security issues. There are so many micro level issues that has to be tackled. And that shows that the two prime ministers would sign uh, agreements, say our prime minister and Bhutanese prime minister would sign an agreement. And that agreement is uh, so ambitious, right? But those agreements are implemented by the state governments, basically, and further given to some kind of other agencies at the border level. And you find that the agencies which are actually doing it at the border level, they do not really connect with what are the aspirations of the two prime ministers, right? And that leads to so many complications. Say, for example, this Subida, right? This is a kind of a, for Bengal government started it saying that in order to make the movement of vehicles between one border to another border, between say Phuncholing in Bhutan to Fulbari corridor, uh, we will impose 5,000 rupees per truck, or depending upon what are the how many wheels the trucks would have, right? And they say that uh, this will this is basically to smoothen the entire traffic. But the problem is the Bhutan would get hardly 2,000 rupees, 3,000 rupees as profit when it sends a truckload of boulders to Bangladesh, right? And here is a rule by the local government, that is the state government, which will require you to pay 5,000 rupees. And the Bhutanese would tell us, whom do we actually negotiate all these? Is it the central government? Because we have all the agreements with the government of India. We have nothing to do with the government of West Bengal. So there are so many mismatches, right? So many mismatches. For a country like Bhutan, it is much more complex, precisely because Bhutan still do not have roads connecting eastern Bhutan, western Bhutan, and southern Bhutan internally, right? They don't have good roads. So they will have to travel through India to go from western Bhutan to eastern and southern Bhutan. Say, for example, to go to Gelefu, they find it much easier to travel from Phuncholing, then to some parts of Bengal to Assam, then finally reaching Gelefu, the Hatisar post, right? Now, in this movement, they face so many difficulties, right? Therefore, what is very critical at this juncture is to have local level integrations. Who are the local private sectors, the customs, the security, right? The testing labs, agencies, that is at a micro level, because all the efforts at the national levels are to a large extent, spoiled by this kind of issues. Say, for example, in the Asian highway between Kakari to in Nepal border to uh, to what you call it Fulbari corridor in Banglaband, there are so many choke points. Now, nobody really talks about these choke points, right? You have a choke point in Bihar mode, in Shiv Mandir mode, in medical mode. We have personally witnessed the trucks are held there for hours together. And that's an Asian highway too, right? So somebody really has to really do this kind of efforts, because the dreams on the Bhutanese side and the Indian side at the macro level, at the national level, are pretty big, right? They are dreaming of integrating Bhutan with Southeast Asia, Nepal with Southeast Asia, and moving through Bhutan, through Bangladesh to northeast part of India. So these things All these things have to be taken care of.
That leads me to the last question, Professor Lama, the concluding question for today's webinar. Also, extending, what do you think is the solution for all of this? Like based on your experience from, from New Delhi, from the neighboring countries, from the ground level, and all the lessons that you have brought forward from both successful stalled projects, suspended projects, difficult corridors, difficult movements. What are the lessons that should guide India-Bhutan connectivity for the next decade so that we don't have to, so that we don't face the same kind of problems going forward in the next 10 years, so that we're not talking about the same kind of issues in the next 10 years, let's say?
I think I would pinpoint three very basic issues. First is India's approach and outlook towards land borders have to drastically undergo changes. Land borders are not like seaports or airports. Land borders are about culture, food, language, environment, natural resources, disasters, so many things, which you don't find in the uh, ports and the seaports and the airports. That means it requires a treatment which is absolutely different from the seaports and the airports. The example, of course, is look at the technologies that are used in the land borders. You are in the Indira Gandhi Airport in Delhi. You are talking about third generation customs equipment, and even first generation custom equipments have not reached these land borders. And many of the people who are posted there, they think that it is a punishment posting, so they would like to look back. They don't know India's history with Myanmar, with Bangladesh, with Nepal, with Bhutan, right? The first is we must change the entire outlook and approaches to the land borders. The second very critical thing is we must create a model of interdependence. You know, we have seen, many of us who have been studying this regionalism process, the more you promote dependency model, at a particular time, you will suddenly find the partner countries are withdrawing from the process. That's how this ARC process to a large extent failed. And I see similar problems happening in BIMSTEC also, right? So you create interdependency. And the one way to create interdependency is, of course, make these partners, you make this, you should depend on these partners. Say if Bhutan gives some kind of transit facilities to India, right, to the Indian states between say Arunachal Pradesh and Assam. If Nepal gives transit facilities between Sikkim and Eastern Nepal and Siliguri, right, and if Bangladesh gives transit facilities to join to connect with the Northeast, I think this kind of interdependence model in terms of goods, services, connectivity have to be done. Say, for example, nobody thinks about a kind of one-hop flight between Shillong and Dhaka. All right, everybody would like to come. Nobody would think about a one-hop flight from Guwahati to Thimphu, right? So why not we do this? The third very important thing is you diversify the partnerships. You bring as diverse partners as possible. Don't make it a state-centric project, a government-centric project. After all, the real actors are private sectors, right? After all, the real actors are the local people, and the real gains would start emanating from that particular point. So you must involve people, communities, private sector, civil society, and all of these projects. And you must distinguish between a local corridor and a national corridor. Say Tamu and More border, you have put all the local things also in that corridor, and all the bilateral things also, exchanges also in that corridor. Why don't you make it? So in one of our reports to the government of India, we have said you make two parallel corridors, a corridor that is local and a corridor that is bilateral. And that would really strengthen the process and consolidate the process. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Lama. Three very important interventions, both from how do we think about the neighborhood to, how do we implement things, how do we practically implement things at the ground level. Tino, lastly, asking the same question to you. What lessons should policymakers in both countries take to ensure long-term success going forward of India-Bhutan connectivity projects?
Okay, let me add two more to the four I shared before in terms of mobility and engaging the world, explaining to people why connectivity matters in that political mission, and of course, doggedly pursuing infrastructure. I actually think a little bit more optimistic than Professor Lama for a change. I think we're actually on the right course. It's a question of pace. It's a question of resources. At least my sense is that today this has been, for the first time in many years now, understood as a national priority in India and across the neighborhood. Everyone realizes that this must happen. Resources are being allocated. Of course, whether they use, how they use now is a question of assessment that varies, but I think the direction is right. The urgency is set. The pace must be faster. Often I say that, India and its neighbors today are doing more than ever. They're actually doing faster than ever. They're doing better than ever on various connectivity linkages, but it's still paradoxically too slow, too little, not good enough. Given the world around us that is changing very fast, given, for example, also the pressures that we're experiencing from people in this region that did not exist 20, 30 years ago. People today demand, expect infrastructure and development solutions that hinge on mobility with neighboring countries. Riya, I'll just end on one note, which I think is maybe a bit broad, but very important. And this is being watched very closely here in Delhi, is the temptation to politicize connectivity. We must, everyone in this region, be able to decouple the political relations between governments from the agenda that is mutually beneficial, sometimes leads to disagreements on trade asymmetry, where's the bridge going to be built, what financing mechanism. Fine, India and Bangladesh have differences on that, on the trade asymmetry, on water. But that discussion cannot, must not stop. And I think across the region, fortunately, I think, have seen with my engagements here in Delhi that within India generally, there is a sense that we will continue working on economic partnerships with our neighboring countries, whatever happens, except in very dire circumstances where someone takes a very hostile move. But even on Bangladesh, since August last year, I mean, India continued focusing on connectivity, but also could not resist the temptation to weaponize its transshipment rights. And that was the only act it took eventually. And that ideally should not happen, must not happen. Vice versa for other neighboring countries. I can't think of a single member of the interim cabinet of the interim government in Bangladesh that has said something to the point of, we must develop economic linkages with India. Sheikh Hasina didn't do it very well, but we must continue negotiate, and our future development path in Bangladesh hinges on better economic relations with India. How no one is able to say that in 9 or 10 months in Bangladesh beats me. And I think it's an example of something that is also understood loud and clear here in Delhi and resented. Vice versa in Bhutan, a good example. A country whose leadership has consistently explained to its people that we may have sometimes our differences with India, but we will continue investing in long-term interdependence with India because it benefits us. And so I think across the region, you see very interesting variations of leaders that cannot resist this temptation, including in India sometimes, and leaders that are able to take that tough choice, go to the public square, and explain that more connectivity with India is in their own interest. And that includes sometimes including very surprising actors like the current president of Sri Lanka, who you would not have expected, given the background of the Sri Lankan president, the political party that he leads, to be able to say this. But we're seeing a good moment in India-Sri Lanka relations precisely because the Sri Lankan president has been able to communicate this and understands this and sells it wherever he goes, that we need a very good economic relationship with India. And I'll leave it at that. I mean, that I think is a big challenge, but I think that is what everyone in this region expects.
Thank you. Thank you for summarizing all of that, because a lot is happening in the neighborhood, especially in this connectivity space, and we often take it for granted. But it's also important to emphasize and going forward, see what a functional connectivity would look like, irrespective of what is happening at the political level. Are we at a stage where we can achieve that? We've seen mixed signals till now. You highlighted some, but there's still some way to go in sort of achieving that vision of connectivity over the next decade. On that note, we come to the end of our discussion today. Thank you so much, Professor Lama and Tino, for joining us today, for sharing your insights on this topic. And I hope we can continue the conversation as we build the database. As we see more projects developing, as we see timelines shrinking, as we see more entities coming into the projects, we hope that this builds the pace for more research and more policy interventions when it comes to India's connectivity agenda. Thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you so much for the audience also for being with us today. Thank you.
Thank you, Riya.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.